As we get a day closer to UConn versus Gonzaga, what can we expect? And will it be deja vu all over again? Find out. You're on Locked On.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Before we dive into today's show, just want to take a moment to say thank you to all the fans. This podcast has grown exponentially over the last 8-9 months, and it's because of people like you, our everydayers. So we are proud to say we are the only daily podcast that covers both the UConn men and women's basketball and a little bit of football, the absolute basketball capital of the world. We're thrilled to bring you this coverage that you absolutely deserve. To show that gratitude, we're giving back, not to you guys, but indirectly. We're giving back 10% of our revenue to the Husky Ticket Project, helping send kids to games that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. That's the men and the women, football and baseball in the spring. We also make a monthly donation to Bleeding Blue for Good, supporting NIL initiatives that make a difference for us. If you're enjoying the show, take a moment to subscribe and follow. Leave a review wherever you listen. Hopefully you're listening to the audio version as well. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet and get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com to get started. Okay, on the program today, we have a special guest because I wanted this week to be all about Gonzaga once we got past the remnants of the Texas game. We bring in Conor Hope of HeatCheck College Basketball, and he does previews and recaps for Sleepers Media. He also is a member of the United States Basketball Writers Association and a Gonzaga grad to boot. Who better to talk about him than Conor? Let's bring him into the program. Conor, I gotta ask you a quick question right off the bat, because we talked pre-show about, there's a history of the last couple of years where UConn has really kind of disposed of Gonzaga. But what should the Husky fans on our side know about the Bulldogs 2024 team? Who are their key players? What are their strengths?
Yeah, I mean, I think right off the bat, the two key players are players that you've seen before. Saw them last year, that being Ryan Nembhard, Graham Ike. Obviously playing, I think, a little bit better than they were last year at the time that they were playing UConn. But Ryan Nembhard is the leader in the country in assists. Graham Ike's had a little bit of a struggle this year getting consistent play. But again, he is one of the most efficient low post scorers in the country. They've also added Caliph Battle from Arkansas, who has been kind of a little bit of a spark plug in that starting lineup. And beyond that, it's kind of the same faces: Braden Huff, Nolan Hickman, Ben Gregg, Dusty Stromer, Michael Ajayi, who is a transfer from Pepperdine, also gets some runs.
Yep.
So I think it's a deeper team than they had last year. And despite their struggles early this season, I still think they're playing at a more consistent high level right now than they were at the same time last year.
It's a great point. I appreciate you bringing that up. I think for us, and maybe you can speak to this, have you guys had any trouble with bigger guards? Because one of the issues that we've had is I think we match up pretty well against you, because with our guards, whether it's talking about Hassan Diarra, Ada Mahaney, who you guys know very well, and Solo Ball, no one's above 6'3". And so some of the issues that we've had this year are larger guards that have been able to kind of bully UConn. It hasn't been that way in the past. This is new for us in that respect. Do you feel that's something that they've struggled with, or because of Nembhard's quickness, has he been able to negate that?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the two games they lost. Jackson Robinson had to come in there at the point guard spot for Kentucky and did a good job as a larger guard. They played West Virginia. Not really a large guard issue. Javon Small's only 6'3", but more of if you have a guard that can score at multi-levels, like a Solo Ball, that can be such an issue for this Gonzaga team, because they're really good at running three-point shooters off the line. We saw that with Kobe Brea for Kentucky. They're really good, I think, at not switching, but helping on guards that can drive. But if you get a guard that can shoot the three and also beat their man to the rim, like that is going to be to me, and it's always been this way for Gonzaga. That's been the Gonzaga killer, is just a multi-level, I can take the ball and do me type of guard. Javon Small had a big second half for West Virginia and Gonzaga's loss. Jackson Robinson had a big second half for Kentucky and Gonzaga's loss. And that, I think, was kind of the difference with a big like Carr or your wing like Tucker DeVries kind of helping take some of the pressure off that guard as well.
No, it's fair enough. Last question on kind of this matchup with it being in Madison Square Garden. This has been dubbed Store South by not only just from our fan base, but a lot of people call it that. I feel like UConn is using that Store South. It's in Boston. It's Stores North. They tend to do that a lot with our neutral site games. Do you feel like that's like a much bigger advantage? I know we beat you in Seattle last year, but that team last year was, it's another story. Do you think the advantage of playing in Madison Square Garden is going to be the difference in what I expect to be a close game?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I've been to a UConn game in Madison Square Garden. It is as home friendly, if not even more so, just based on the size, as playing in Stores. So I think it's going to be a tough environment for Gonzaga. They've been good, not great away from home this season. So I think that's where, like, if UConn starts to score, that's where the points and the runs can really pile up for the Huskies.
Absolutely. All right. When we come back from the break, we're going to talk about revisiting a little bit of this UConn dominance over the last couple of years. Has that had some residual effect on Gonzaga? Maybe some of the players that are left behind. I don't think there's that many, but we're going to ask Conor about that. And we're going to talk through that and much more coming up after the break. What's up, your friends from Game Time? The easiest way to find tickets. It's not just about the atmosphere of watching a game. It's about going to a game and not worrying about how you get your tickets. Use the Game Time app. And if you haven't done this already, because I know I've done this ad about 1,000 times. So if this is your first time listening to this show, use this app. I swear it's one of the best in the business. They have insurance for your tickets. You can absolutely see the view from your seat. There is not a worry. You can do it all the way to Game Time. That's why it's called Game Time. So you don't have to worry about scalping tickets or any of that stuff. Download the app. Use the promo code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. It is an absolute no-brainer, whether you're doing college, NBA, WNBA, anything. Get your tickets through the Game Time app. All right, we're back on Locked On UConn with Conor Hope. Conor, we talked about some of the challenges that Gonzaga's had against multi-layer scorers, but they've had some challenges against UConn as a whole the last couple times they played. You're a Gonzaga grad. I know that you told me pre-show that you spent some time in Connecticut. What do you think it is about these last couple UConn teams that Gonzaga hasn't been able to get over the hump or really even be competitive against? The last year was a little closer than I think the score showed, but UConn, I don't think ever felt threatened. It was a wire-to-wire win. Why is that going to be different this time?
I mean, it might not be, to be frank. Like it depends on how much the UConn defense has actually come along from the beginning of the season. Look, Gonzaga is a team. It's weird because they're a team that likes to get up and down the floor, but they also love to play through their bigs. And I think the past 2 years, 2022-23 season, you had a Gonzaga team that really didn't have a point guard. They were running Nolan Hickman at the point. Nolan Hickman is more of a two guard. Weren't able to make a lot of plays. Last year, obviously, they ran a lot through Graham Ike. Donovan Clingan is a way better big, especially defending the post than I think Ike had handled all season. And so I think this year, the difference to me is that you don't have right now on the surface a dominant big at UConn. You have two really, really good centers in Samson Johnson, Terrace Reed, but you don't have a dominant big. And I think that's where Gonzaga might look to take advantage. Because look, you have a potential lottery pick in Liam McNeely. You have Alex Caravan at the 4, who's been one of the most consistent players in the country, has now taken the mantle as the leader on this team. I mentioned solo ball earlier in the recording. But to me, it's Terrace, Reed, Samson, Johnson. Can you get them into foul trouble? Can you play through EK and Huff enough to force an Alex Caravan at the 5 type of situation? And I think that's where Gonzaga can take advantage. I also think Gonzaga probably has an advantage at the point guard spot from a consistency perspective. But again, Gonzaga has 1 point guard. The past couple of good Gonzaga teams have had 2 that they can rely upon. So I think where it's different, this team is better defensively than it's been the last 2 years. But really for me, it is where they had a big disadvantage at the 5 spot, just from being able to do what they wanted to do as an offense. This year, I don't feel like that disadvantage is quite there.
No, I'm with you there. I think something that you can look for. I don't know how much you followed the Huskies, but against Baylor, with Alex out, Dan put in Samson and Terrace to play together, and it kind of gave them a really weird new dynamic that even Evan Mia was just like, this could be their best lineup that they've had. I think they outscored Baylor 25-14 in a very small sample in like a 10-minute stretch. And with the bigs that you have, I could see him doing that in a small stretch because it actually allows Samson to get away from the basket more and let him roam as kind of an athletic 4 who's not really an outside threat, but he was better in trail defense, in rotational defense, and that could potentially be something to look at for both of our sides. But also, we'll also see how the whistle is blown, right? I think if Samson Johnson is given a little more latitude than he has in the past, then he's actually one of the best shot blockers in the country per 40 minutes. I think he's second or third in the country as far as blocks per game. In kind of in the advanced metrics, but he has to stay on the floor, right? If we see Yusef Singari, then both of our guys are in foul trouble because that's what happened against Baylor as well, or Texas. But also it helped because he got 4 fouls in the first half, and it took away from the guys. And both Terrace and Samson had 3 total each, which is like a huge win for UConn this year. So that's a great point. Yeah, I think in the past, you're right. Donovan obviously is one of the most impactful players to play college basketball in the last couple of years. So there's none of that. We're kind of getting away from what I wanted to talk about, which is the past history, but I don't care because what's happening on Saturday is more important than what happened in 1999 today to people that are watching. So what I will ask you is, do you think that a guy like Nembhard, if he gets in foul trouble, is that a huge issue for Gonzaga? As you mentioned, they only have 1 point guard. Like who else runs the point if he's sitting on the bench or if he gets into foul trouble?
It's either Hickman or Caleb Battle. We've seen Battle do it, I think, a little bit more. I think he's a little bit more of a drive and kick.
Yeah.
Demands a little bit more defensive attention on ball so he can get some good passes into the lane to guys like Braden Huff or Ben Gregg. Whereas Hickman has been the point guard for this team before, but I think he's at his best kind of in the corner, being that multi-level. If you don't close out on me, I'll shoot it. If you close out too hard, I'll run the baseline and shoot a little bit of like a runner, a baseline runner, sure, which he's really good at. So my guess would be Caleb Battle, but that's the issue. Is it's a guess at this point. What we've seen in the games against West Virginia and Kentucky, specifically Kentucky, is that Nembhard, like his brother, is really good and at his best when he gets paint touches, when he gets into the paint and can make decisions either going up for like a layup off the glass or kicking it out, maybe kind of dishing it underneath to EK, things like that. Kentucky ran a 1-3-1 zone, and looking back at the film, Nembhard didn't get a single paint touch. When they were playing West Virginia in that second half did a really good job at limiting the paint touches for Ryan Nembhard. And what that does is it just breaks apart Gonzaga's entire offense. And what we've seen, not just in those 2 games, but even against Arizona State, is when Gonzaga's offense is struggling, their defense struggles even more. And it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing, but I think it is one of the most, if you're a Gonzaga fan, one of the most frustrating things is that it seems like every time they miss a shot when they're struggling to score, their opponent gets a good shot on the other end. And so if you're UConn, your key, even though Graham Ike might be the one who's going to take a bulk of the shots, your key is shut down Ryan Nembhard.
Yep.
And force someone else to make plays for Gonzaga.
I totally agree with you. We that goes back to I'm probably older than you. I don't know, but when UConn was facing Duke in 1999, they and even before then, that first Final Four, they said, they started the cut this head off the snake with Ricky Moore. And so whoever the point guard is, that was their mantra, is like, if you disrupt that, you disrupt the whole process. So UConn's history of that is definitely of doing so. So I'm going to bank on that, because I think Haas is good enough to be up for the challenge. He did it last year against Tyler Kolek. I think he can do it against Nembhard, but only time will tell. All right, man. When we return, we have one more segment. We're going to talk about the significance of this matchup. Probably ask one more question around your thoughts on what people are calling, if you look at advanced metric sites, Evan Maya, Ken Palm, Gonzaga is 4th and 1st in those metrics. Ask you about why you think that is, and if you can kind of give some people some idea of some perspective on that when we return. What's up, everybody? You can tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place, and when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you get the latest stats, you live play-by-play, and so much more in the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste the hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, you're back on Locked On UConn with Conor Hope here with us today to preview the Gonzaga game. All right, Conor, when you get a chance here, let's talk through this litmus test. Is this a bigger game for UConn, or is it a bigger game for Gonzaga?
I think it's still a bigger game for UConn. I think the stench of Feast Week, if they can go 3-0 against Baylor, Texas, and then Gonzaga, would be almost eliminated. You look at Gonzaga, they have the road win against San Diego State, who looks to be like they're still San Diego State. They blew out Baylor. They have the win against Arizona State. That's been looking good. They recovered after their loss against West Virginia. Their 2 losses, while the circumstances and the situation around those losses makes them worse, we're still 2 overtime losses that should be quadrant 1 losses. And like at the end of the season, I don't think anyone's going to look at a loss to Kentucky and be like, oh, that's a bad loss. Sure. Where it becomes, I think, more significant for Gonzaga, if Gonzaga gets up big early, then a win is more significant, because if they give up a 3rd loss after being up big early, I think the alarm bells and the situation for this team and around this team changes a little bit. But for UConn, I think they're looking to get back into, we are a national championship contender. Baylor doesn't look like the team everyone thought they were preseason. Texas, while good, is not an elite team. I still think, despite the 2 losses, giving up double-digit leads in both of those, Gonzaga is still viewed very much so as a top 15 team in the country. And so for UConn, if they're playing in a pseudo home environment against Gonzaga and they lose,
right,
I think there's going to be maybe not necessarily alarm bells, because they've just come off 2 national championships. They have a coach, if not the best coach in the country, is the 2nd best coach in the country. But I think for this team in this season, if they lose this game against Gonzaga, you can start to lower expectations significantly for this UConn team. I think Gonzaga's expectations among its fan base have already been lowered because of their 2 losses. So for me, I think UConn needs this game more than Gonzaga. But like I said, if Gonzaga jumps out to a lead, then my answer will change, because they can't give up 3 big leads.
Fair.
in games against good competition.
Let me you brought something up that I wasn't going to ask, but I'd be curious the answer to this. What is the expectation of a Gonzaga fan? Because I don't know.
Entering the season, I think it was national championship or Final Four at least. Like they were a team that was returning more players from last year's Sweet 16 team than basically any other team in the country. They lost Anton Watson, but you expected Caleb Battle and Michael Ajayi to be better. I think at this point in the season, the expectation is let's just continue the streak. Let's just get to the Sweet 16 because we've seen 2 collapses in the matter of 2 weeks. But I still think the expectation should be Final Four. It's just Michael Ajayi has not been the player that fans expected when he was coming over from Pepperdine. There's been some weird rotations, I think, based on comfort and familiarity with the system in these games where Gonzaga was giving up big leads. And with one point guard, the ceiling for Gonzaga's teams are always lower than if you have, like, if you look at the past teams, their first number 1 team, they had David Stockton, Kevin Pangos, 2 point guards. 2017, when they went to the national championship game, they had Nigel Williams-Goss and Josh Perkins, 2 point guards. 2021, when they went to the national championship game again, they had Jalen Suggs and Andrew Nembhard, 2 point guards.
Sure.
This season, they don't have that. So I think the national championship expectations might have been a little bit too high to start the year. And it might have been based primarily on the factors. And Evan Mia kind of fueled this by saying like the important things for
they're number 1 still. Yeah, they're still number 1 in his rankings.
But also his keys to winning the national championship game were returning players, transfer portal, etc. I just don't know if Gonzaga has yet found that guy that can help them win these close games. And we were hoping it would be Caleb Battle, but he hasn't really been in the game to show up in those big moments, except for the turnover at the end of regulation against West Virginia. So I think the expectations among the fan base are shooting down faster than they probably should. I still think the floor expectation for this Gonzaga team is Sweet 16.
Okay, that's fair. Well, speaking of expectations, we brought in a guy that you're very familiar with, and Aidan Mahaney, played at St. Mary's for a couple of years. He has not lived up to what initially thought, in my estimation and others. Dan and others in the staff have preached, patience and trying to have a little grace with him, given the geographical switch and also style of play. In your estimation, why do you think that Aidan hasn't come in and been? I don't think anyone thought he was going to be a 14-point scorer at UConn, but why hasn't he been able to assimilate quicker in your estimation?
So when you look at, and this was something that I had brought up, I think it was on Sleepers a couple months ago about Aidan Mahaney, which is he was very good in the context of St. Mary's offense because he didn't need to handle the ball and he didn't need to play defense. He was a player that could go out there, get hot, find his spots. You had the WCC Player of the Year in Augustus Marshallonis at point guard. You had the WCC Defensive Player of the Year in Mitchell Saxon at center. You had, when in his freshman season, you also had Logan Johnson, Alex Dukas. Like, you had players around him that took all the pressure off of him to the point where he was just a cog, just one of the guys that also happened to be someone who could get hot and score at a high level, right? And I think the expectations at UConn when he first got there, and it seemed like Hurley echoed them a little bit, was for him to be the point guard, which never really made sense to me. He's more of a combo guard, and early in the season watching him, he looked hesitant to score. He looked like, I'm the point guard, I need to make plays for others. And you saw him go to the rim and he was really good. And then he just settled for jumpers the rest of the game and then couldn't play defense. So he couldn't play second halves. I think he's looked more comfortable as the season's gone on. He's been making plays at a higher rate. But I do think there is something to be said about the fact that both of these teams, I mean, Gonzaga has the number 1 assist man in the country, but both of these teams have an issue at the point guard spot when it comes to either not having that elite point guard for UConn or not having any depth at the spot for Gonzaga. And Aiden Mahaney's struggles this season, I think, are more a symptom of that than necessarily anything specifically he's doing.
Yeah, no, I agree to a certain extent. I appreciate that perspective. One of the things that I brought up in his recruitment in the transfer portal, like if we went back to whenever that was, I think it's in July or something. I said, I guarantee after watching a lot of, I'm a hoops head. I'm on the East Coast, but I watch a lot of West Coast basketball. So watching a lot of St. Mary's, watching Gonzaga, games that Aiden played early in the year, like not to denigrate any programs, but against like a Portland or a Pepperdine who aren't elite programs. He struggled sometimes against these smaller schools, maybe in the same respect of what you're talking about, where he felt like he was just a part of the machine. Whereas Dan, and I knew this without actually talking to anybody on the staff, they wanted to challenge him, be like, hey, if you come here, you're going to, when you play a bye game or when you play one of these smaller schools, we want you to dominate them and not just have your 25-point game against Gonzaga and everyone be, fantastic about that. So I do feel like he's trying to get to that point where he feels that kind of killer instinct at all times. And I do think Dan, and I'll give one negative criticism of Dan Hurley on this is I feel like he did him a little bit of a disservice by saying he wants him to be a hybrid of Cam Spencer and Tristan Newton, two guys who are 6'5" and now play in the NBA. Cam Spencer just scored 14 points in the NBA last night or a couple nights ago, 51 points in the G League. Like Aiden's not that guy. But I think he can get there if he's given time, right? And I think with UConn, because of the expectation of, hey, we're going for a three-peat, he doesn't have that. And you have a freshman in Ahmad Noel who's knocking on the door, and Hassan Diarra who's a sixth man of the year. So I think it's like to your point, it's like a perfect storm of things. So yeah, I do think though when Gonzaga shows up on Saturday, you might see a familiar Aiden Mahaney against you guys because I don't know. Sometimes familiarity breeds, a spark. Do you think that's something that could happen?
Yeah, I do, but I think because Aiden Mahaney came up in big spots against Gonzaga. He wasn't necessarily, if you look at all of his games against Gonzaga, fantastic. Part of the reason why St. Mary's was so good against Gonzaga the last couple of years is because, and you watch Gonzaga this year, it's the same thing. They love the mid pick and roll. They love to throw Huff or EK out there, run Ryan Nemhard off a screen, do a mid pick and roll with Huff or EK. And St. Mary's defensively is one of the best pick and roll defenses every single year under Randy Bennett. That's just like they shut down the pick and roll and force you to do something else. And it allowed St. Mary's to stay in these games so that Aiden Mahaney could come up in big moments. Because most of his scoring, most of his big moments were second half moments late in games, in close games against Gonzaga. I do think that the pressure of trying to be a Tristan Newton, and I did a piece on Tristan Newton during the Final Four last year about how Tristan Newton is, by all intents and purposes, the most successful point guard in UConn history. And that's a history that includes guys like Kemba Walker.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
To compare him to compare him to Cam Spencer, who I'm convinced just sleeps with basketballs, was a little bit of a disservice.
Like this on both arms.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I've had some criticisms for Hurley this offseason, and early on this season. But I do think
you and everybody else.
Well, it was the media tour, where every turn he had, like Evan Mia had UConn at 8, and it's fair, I think, when you're replacing Klingon with Terrace Reed, when you're replacing Newton and Spencer with Aiden Mahaney, when you're replacing Steph Castle with Liam McNeely, who you don't really know, when your best player goes from being your 4th or 5th best player to being your best player, like things like that, right? I thought 8th was a perfect spot. Like it shows that they're still a really talented team. They have a really talented coaching staff, but they are taking a step back in terms of what we view their talent as. And then he went on the media tour and called Evan Mia out, and then they lose 3 straight games in Maui.
I will say this, I'll defend Dan on one point, and this is something that I feel like he should have crystallized it a lot better, but I think also he likes to tweak the media more, and it's kind of a performative type thing. When he called out Evan, I DM'd Evan he came on the show and we had some fun and we talked about, all of this. And so I feel like that kind of cleared some stuff up. But the other side of this is from a coaching perspective, when you've won back-to-back national championships, one of the things that he brought to the table, and it also came off the heels of Alex Caravan not being named preseason All-American by CBS. And so he got hold of that. And he said, I think we essentially value a lot of the wrong things in college basketball. We kind of get ourselves all enamored with hype versus someone who's been a two-time national champion and one of the best winners in college basketball. Follow that up with his comment about, at this point, whether we're national championships or not, you win back-to-back, you've been given the benefit of the doubt to be the number one team in the country until someone knocks them off. And as we saw in Maui, they weren't the number one team in the country. I don't think that was his point. Like, I think his point was, what do we have to win 7 in a row for you guys to give us preseason number one? And it's just the tongue-in-cheek nature. And I think the one thing I will say is I get a little frustrated with bigger media outlets that love him one day, hate him the next day. And he's always consistent. And I feel like the coverage of him is not.
Yeah, and I tweeted this out a couple weeks ago. I tweeted out his record in close games at UConn, which is it's not good.
It's not good.
It's not good. And a part of that is the way he coaches. But the way he coaches is also the reason why they won 2 national championships without a single game in those tournaments being close. So it is the double-edged sword of Dan Hurley, where I think it doesn't necessarily hurt you in close games, but it might not help you in close games.
Give me an example of what you mean.
So like the performative stuff with the refs and I think you look at coaches that win close games, most of the time they're even keeled because they want their players to be even keeled, because when you have close games and you're getting all bent out of shape, your players start to pick up on that. Mm-hmm. And he had a good close game records earlier in his career. The last 2 stops haven't been great. But I do think that like that technical could have been, might have been, and probably was the difference in that game, right? Like things like that, where I don't disagree with him, but you look at coaches with fantastic close game records. The only coach I think that's in the same conversation as Dan Hurley for best coach in the country and Bill Self. And he doesn't let anything get to him. And he doesn't do the performative things. And I think his teams pick up on that. But again, I also don't think the ceiling of his teams are ever the same compared to their talent as Dan Hurley's ceiling, because Dan Hurley brings that same energy to practices. He brings that same energy to play the 350th best team in the country. Right. And so they're constantly trying to get better. They're constantly like, they're not going to try any harder against Texas than they are against DePaul.
No, I agree with you. And I think and I totally agree with you. I'm sorry to cut you off. I agree that he's even acknowledged it lately where, some people got a hold of him and really kind of had to, especially with the team he has right now, where he can't focus on the refs as much because of what they need from him on a game-to-game basis. And he probably didn't realize that prior to winning national championships, and that's why his record wasn't as good in those close games. So I will close on this, and then I will get a prediction from you about what this game is. That Maui tournament, when Hubert Davis gets a technical foul, those refs were awful because Hubert doesn't even swear. So my guy literally ran out to half court on some calls. So I don't know what they were smoking out in Maui, but I know Dan doesn't want any part of it ever again. All right, my man. I appreciate you being on. Before we go, what is your prediction for Saturday?
I think it's a lot closer than the last 2 games have been. I think it's back and forth. I don't think necessarily Gonzaga, because Gonzaga's gotten out to big leads in basically every game they've played. I don't think that's the case here, because I think Hurley, it has that familiarity. Kamani Young, fantastic defensive coach. He's going to get his players in positions where even if Gonzaga has some runs, it'll be like a 7-3, 7-2 run. It won't be one of those Evan Mia calls kill shots where it's like kill a 10-0. Yep. But I do think UConn wins this game. There is There is something about the makeup of this Gonzaga team with the 1 point guard that you can shut down and basically shut down their offense, with the fact that if you shut down their offense, their defense struggles, with the fact that solo ball is the prototypical Zag killer. Like, you run solo ball, and Alex Caravan can sit on the perimeter like a Tucker DeVries was doing, like, or he can go down into the paint like Austin Carr was doing for Kentucky. That's been kind of the recipe this season, early on this season, for beating this Gonzaga team. I think UConn has that, even if the two positions Gonzaga is best are also the two positions where UConn might be the worst. And then you factor in MSG. So I want to say that we have a pretty high scoring affair,
Yeah,
but
I would imagine so.
I do think UConn wins this game. Give me UConn 87-83 over Gonzaga.
As Dickie V used to say, a Maylock smasher. I love it. We'll see, man. I tend to agree with you. I think it could be close. I think what I got encouraging from the Texas game, even though they're not in the same level as Gonzaga from the perspective of scoring, is they had an 81 points per game team that UConn only gave up 65 points against on the road. In particular, when we're talking about stopping one or two guys, that's essentially what they were doing with Texas. I'm not even going to give a prediction, because if I do, it's going to be wrong and I'm going to get crucified for it. But no, I will. I'm going to say I'm going to go UConn 84, Gonzaga 74. I'm going to say it's a 10-point win. But I think that 10 points is going to be because they push it out with like late free throws, not because it's going to be, a double-digit game not double-digit lead all game.
Yeah, I could see that. I could definitely see that.
All right, well, listen, I appreciate you. I know we don't play Gonzaga all the time, but you are a very knowledgeable basketball aficionado, so feel free to drop in on us from time to time. We'll be in touch, and we'd love to have you back on the program. This has been another episode of Locked On UConn. I'm your host, Mark Zanetto, for Conor Hope. We say, well, he doesn't say, but I say, go Huskies.